today for us.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Louise Barker. I'm a workplace consultant with WCB, and really pleased to be co-presenting this webinar today with Heather Matthews. Also being here at Awareness as they're hosting the webinar today, so a nice treat for me. So our webinar this afternoon is the first of 3 to support the steps for safety preventing workplace violence. And we're pleased to offer this complimentary webinar to provide the overview of the violence in health and community services. We're going to go through some statistics, talk about some of the legislative requirements, the background, and a bit of an overview of the steps for safety, but not too much detail this afternoon in this webinar. So this webinar really is intended for anyone as a refresher if you attended the original workshop. If you did attend the original workshop, we have changed things up a little bit and added a bit more information for some things that we've learned during the workshops from you and added that in today. So it should be helpful for anybody who is hearing this for the first time. So as Heather mentioned, we are allocating some time for discussion and a couple of questions throughout the presentation this afternoon and a Q&A at the very end of the webinar. So on the screen, you'll see that we have a couple of pieces of information there on display. So the first being the hyperlink to the Awareness website, and that is where all of the information for steps for safety, the resources are available. So they're all available online. And again, the idea being that they're current, they're up to date, not, like a binder you may receive from another program where it'll sit on a shelf and perhaps get a little bit old and you don't know if it's current or outdated. We'd like to think that all the information that you will tap into from the website is always up to date, current, and hopefully as applicable as it can be for you. So once you click onto the hyperlink, and we're not going to do that now, but you'll be able to see the 3 steps that are currently available, steps 1, 2, and 3. And all the information and the content, either from presentations or the communication or the logo itself, is available for you to use as much or as little as you like. So if you like elements of the program, questions, and you want to adopt those, or if you want to add extra pieces, or if you really like the logo. We really like the logo as it depicts, that we're going to take steps together for safety, and the colors are really quite speak volumes with the anti-violence and the anti-bullying colors that have been chosen and represent really the approach to these resources, and certainly that's something you can use as well. The partners, would be remiss to not speak about the partners for this project. This is a work completed by a number of different people and expertise, and certainly for Heather and I, we rely on our partners and their expertise and knowledge and the work that they do every day to contribute to the resources that have been developed. So while we've met as a committee for a little bit over a year now, quite pleased with our progress and that we've reviewed a lot of information and resources and have developed 3 of 6 steps. And those of you that were present for some of the workshops, we've launched 9 and completed 9 workshops throughout the province. And currently, this is our first webinar. So certainly well under our way with providing this information to you in as various forms as possible to make it applicable and user-friendly. So just a quick recap on the actual 3 steps that are currently available. So each of the steps have the same elements. They all have a communication memo, which is a 1-page summary summarizing the content for the particular step. They each have an introduction or background section providing a bit more detail as to what the purpose of the step is and some information that hopefully will be of assistance while you implement the tools, which is the 3rd component. So each one has a toolkit, and in that toolkit you may have 1 tool, and you can see on step 1 we have 2 tools. We have a program review and a perception survey. So this first step is all about compliance and what is in your program and to review that from a legislative compliance perspective. Step 2 is all about leadership and risk assessment. And Step 3 provides some policies and procedures that are templated to really fill any gaps that have been identified upon completion of Steps 1 and 2. So really the first 3 steps were developed to ensure that the compliance is fulfilled, that fulfill the Nova Scotia violence regulations, but appreciating that that's always the minimum standard and we can go above that with some best practices to hopefully address the incidents that are occurring. So these newspaper clippings that you're seeing right now document what could be identified as probably the impetus to the Nova Scotia violence regulations. So you may recall back in August of 2007, there was a woman working alone at the night shift at an Ultramar gas station in Dartmouth. And she was working the 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, and she was brutally attacked. She was attacked by Michael Robichaud, who entered the Ultramar booth and proceeded to cut off her clothes, sexually assaulted her, and slashed her throat. She managed to contact the emergency support by way of a panic button that was activated in the store, but unfortunately by the time the police arrived, she was already unconscious. She did survive, and this trial has been in the press recently, discussing again that this individual had been released from prison not so long ago before this attack and had a long criminal history and has been identified now as a dangerous offender. So subsequent to the attack, there was a real outcry from the public to have some legislation to prevent something like this happening to anybody in the workplace. So the government responded, and they responded with our Nova Scotia regulations for workplace violence. And then they also complemented that with a specific guidance document for the retail gas sector and for folks who may be working alone. So when we think about our own workplace violence prevention regulations, they became in effect in April of 2008, and they have a number of requirements, and all those requirements are really specific to Step 1, and we can go through that in one of the next webinars. But really looking at from a compliance perspective, we know that you would need to do a risk assessment to determine if there's a risk of violence at your organization. And upon identifying whether or not there's a risk, then there'd be a need to develop a policy prevention statement and also a program. We know that for health and community services that there is a risk of workplace violence, so consequently a program, a prevention statement, and then training for workers would be required for all employers. The legislation that came out is currently scheduled to be reviewed by the Department of Labor and Advanced Education. We're not sure exactly when that will be. We expect in the next coming years with the stage 3 of the reviews. But in all likelihood, they may be looking at some of the best practices that are occurring in other jurisdictions. So stay tuned, but certainly we'll be keeping our eye open for any of the potential changes that may fall out of the regulations.
I'm taking part of a webinar right now. If the monitoring station calls,
I think we're going to mute everybody. Sorry, we got a bit of background noise there. Okay, hopefully that's a little bit better.
Great, no problem. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? I'm not sure if you can mute clear your lines. There we go. Okay. So when we think about workplace violence in the regulations, it is defined. And it's defined to mean any of the following. And you can see that definition on your screen, that we have threats, including those threatening statements or threatening behavior, where an employee believes that they're at risk of physical injury. Also, we have the conduct or attempted conduct of a person that could endanger the physical health or physical safety of an employee. But the legal definition of workplace violence, like everything in occupational health and safety law, always looks at the minimum compliance. So when you look at that definition, and when you consider the risks of violence within your workplace, there's an opportunity to address violence not only from the requirements of the law, but taking those steps that address it specifically for your workplace, which is going above the law and some of the best practices to address what you're seeing. So how your organization defines violence can look quite a little bit different than this and may encompass a number of other different things. So the new resources that we're presenting, step 1 to 3, and the ones that will follow, perhaps you're wondering why now? Why are we doing this, and what's the purpose of it? Well, if we recall 2007, we have when the legislation was brought forward. But after that legislation was brought forward, and again, from the lens of retail gas, not necessarily from the lens of healthcare sector, we know that we do have an increased number of incidents that are occurring. So from 2007 until now, we are still seeing that incidents are increasing and that the lost time frequency and the claims costs are on the rise as well. So a working group, got together and decided to look at this in a bit more detail, look at the statistics, look at the numbers, and look to see what we're doing and could do perhaps better, if not add to our programs to hopefully start to reduce the claims that are occurring. And again, we talked about our wonderful partners in the Prevention Working Group, and you can see their names highlighted for you now on the screen, and certainly their expertise has been invaluable as we go through this project. So these are the numbers. And the significance of starting with the statistics from 2007 is that's when the legislation came into effect. So, at a minimum, we should perhaps expect that those statistics would decrease in both the registered claims, which are the purple, but also the pink total time loss claims. And you don't see that. A slight decrease from 2007 to 2013 in the registered claims, but certainly an increase with respect to the time loss that's been occurring, which suggests that the duration people need the time off work speaks to the severity of the incidents that are occurring. We also know that these statistics are only those that have been reported to the Workers' Compensation Board. So that means that they were a result of medical attention or lost time. It certainly doesn't account for all of the other incidents that may be occurring at the workplace. And based on your feedback while we did our workshops throughout the province, we know that and suspect that in all likelihood many of these incidents are not reported at all. And again, this just identifies the subsector statistics of where these incidents are occurring. And if you were in one of the workshops, you recall that we referenced the article from the CBC News that talked about what they call the 3 most violent places to work in Nova Scotia. And those 3 really are those ones that are highlighted with the largest number of statistics, hospitals, nursing homes, and special care homes. So we've seen a huge increase in the associated costs with these claims, but certainly the statistics suggest that there should be some action and looking into how we can address these and hopefully start to reduce these incidents. So why are they increasing? A lot of discussion about this with our workshops, and certainly when we consider all the reasons, we know that there's no one reason, which makes things, I think, a lot more challenging, but certainly a lot of the reasons that you've identified to us are complex. And whether that's a change in the level of care and support for anybody who we are delivering care to, medication, too much, too little, perhaps too late, and the effects of that medication. The care transitions, repeatedly we've heard that whether someone's transitioning from acute care into long-term care or home care to long-term care or from long-term facility into another facility, that anytime we have a transition for somebody who is in care, that can result in the changes of their behavior and anxiety that can result in perhaps some incidents of violence. Staffing resources, healthcare sector certainly always notorious for perhaps never having enough resources, and whether it's staffing shortages or shift work or shift fatigue in terms of impacts resulting in violence. And one perhaps which is a good shift, and we've highlighted this because this was reinforced throughout the province, was that employees are no longer accepting violence as part of the job. So it may have been that old perception and thought that this was, what to expect, and that there was perhaps no intention from a resident to harm somebody while they're at work, but certainly it's not acceptable to come to work and to be the subject of any sort of violence during the course of the workday. And people are reporting more and certainly looking to address this and solve this and not have it as part of their job. That really kind of ties into the next bullet about the changing demographics of the staff, but we're also seeing staff who are going into second careers, perhaps that have retired earlier and taking on a second career, and what does that change of staff and their familiarity with healthcare, and or does the changing scope of the delivery of care and folks that need care, has that changed so much? Are our staff in our schools keeping up with providing that education before people come into the workplace? Unmet needs or unrecognized triggers, often, identifying those can be a huge preventative mechanism. Other support services, we've heard that in the event that there is violence, how do police resources respond? Changes within the government from how things are funded and, again, back to resources are a difficult situation as well. The demographics of the persons needing care and perhaps sometimes some medical support that's lacking in the community. And that was specific to expertise such as psychologists or psychiatrists or other experts in the community where sometimes it's a little bit harder to tap into and maybe not enough of those people that are available within your regions. So by no means easy, and certainly complex and certainly challenging. And we've said before, and I'll repeat again, that these steps aren't there as a suggestion that they will solve all the problems and address everything, but we hope that there are elements in these steps, and as you move forward with your program development, that we can capture some components that can start to minimize and hopefully at some point eliminate the incidence of workplace violence. Reason being, we know the impact of workplace violence. We know that it impacts the quality of life for staff. We know that it impacts your ability as an organization to deliver what you need to deliver, your effectiveness, and it really ultimately negatively impacts on the provision and the quality of care. So we wanted to share with you sort of a current story from Vancouver. And in Vancouver, there was a situation where a worker was brutally attacked, and as a result, the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority has been fined $75,000 subsequent to the investigation of this incident. So we're going to watch the video, and then we're going to open up for some discussion about the issue that occurred.
A healthcare worker who was badly injured in an attack by a psychiatric patient is sharing her story tonight. The incident resulted in a rare fine being leveled against her employer Vancouver Coastal Health. Investigators say a series of safety violations put the recreational therapist in grave danger. As Natalie Clancy reports, the situation created a perfect storm for trouble on a unit for the most mentally ill patients in the region.
I knew I was in trouble because his eyes were like nothing I'd ever seen before.
It was St. Patrick's Day 2012. Pam Owen could feel the tension among her patients. The recreational therapist was new to the cramped temporary ward in the basement of UBC Hospital when a male patient twice her size didn't like being told to wash his urine-soaked clothing.
He grabbed my throat, forced me backwards.
The assault went on for several minutes.
My head was hanging off the washing machine. You know, every time he punched it, it would just get whipped back and forth.
Only one other nurse was on duty.
I was wondering why they were taking so long to get him off of me.
A nearby nurse's panic alarm failed. It took 5 minutes and 3 nurses to stop the attack.
No doubt in my mind that I would not be here today if the male nurses had not been able to pull him off me.
2.5 years later, she has post-traumatic stress and is still on painkillers.
WorkSafe BC investigated and found so many safety violations, they just imposed a $75,000 fine against Vancouver Coastal Health. One of the big problems, this patient had a history of assaulting workers, yet that key information was missing from his chart.
I certainly did not know enough about his history. Otherwise, I probably would have handled everything differently.
We take full accountability for that. It's also what triggered all of the changes in the systems that we've put into place now.
While safety has improved now, the investigation came down hard on managers who botched the transfer of the psych unit to Vancouver General Hospital. When all the beds weren't ready, 6 patients known to have the most potential for violence with the most challenging behavior were left behind with the most junior staff.
Was there any consequences at all for the managers who decided to take the 6 most unstable, potentially dangerous patients and leave them with the most junior staff? Well, I mean, it's not about blame. There were gaps in the system, and the areas that the systems we've now put in place are focusing on like physical layout, on staffing, on education.
Today, Pam Owen was offered a new job in education. She will gradually return to work as a violence prevention specialist and hopes no other healthcare worker will suffer what she did.
Vancouver Coastal Health says it will pay the fine, but first, it's asking WorkSafe BC if it can put that $75,000 towards its own violence prevention program. Natalie Clancy, CBC News, Vancouver.
Okay, so now we're going to unmute everybody. And as I commented there, this was the perfect storm. So huge amounts of problems that were occurring and lots of different reasons for why this occurred. But if this was you and you were the employer in this situation, what do you think you would do first? What will be some of your first next steps? I'm not sure if anybody can hear each other there.
No. Speaking.
No. So some of the things that came up through the investigation, and if you do get the AWARE newsletter, this was linked and you can see the full investigation. But they talked about, you know, certainly the case charts and the notes, and noting somebody came with a history of violence and what was shared and what was documented. Risk assessment, you know, from a facility that had been located somewhere else, moved temporarily to a new location. And we hear about that a lot where, you know, we've got a renovation occurring and we're just going to move a program or part of a workplace into a new spot for a period of time. And do we think about at that point doing a risk assessment as required to see if there's anything that we need to do to make sure that we're covered in an emergency? You know, can you communicate? It's one thing to be able to have tools to communicate in an emergency, but certainly another to make sure that they do work. So a lot of issues, and certainly it puts this concern on the radar of a lot of organizations where we see such a huge financial repercussions, certainly with the $75,000, but more importantly, that personal impact to somebody who has been affected by workplace violence.
Okay, so I'm going to mute everybody again for a little bit, just to keep the background noise down. And we wanted to start with a little bit about what, after being out in the community, what we have learned from you and what you've shared. And I think it's just as a little bit of an update, we had a tremendous response, and we actually had 268 people attend our sessions from 112 organizations. So I think that was very significant. And I don't know that we had a preconceived idea what that number would be, but we're happy with that. We know that everybody couldn't attend, and we know that it didn't work out for all organizations, which is why we're doing the webinars, and why we may consider doing select workshops again on this topic around the province if there's a need. The other thing, when people attended the workshops, they filled out a questionnaire that provided a lot of feedback to us about the presentation, and we were able to and the program and make changes as we went. But the question we asked, will you be applying or using the resources in your organization? And the fact that during our surveys, 91% of the people who attended said they were going to use the tools. So I think that's very significant. One of the things that we talk about when we look at workplace violence, we really have to consider people's perceptions and perspectives. And it's important for us to understand how it is as us as individuals define and describe workplace violence. And it's also how our colleagues and how the organization defines workplace violence. And then, of course, there's the legislative requirement or description of workplace violence that Louise covered a little earlier. And it's really important when we think about, and one of the things we talk about is if you choose to do the perception survey, which I think a lot of people are choosing to do that as part of their step one, it's not just what people put down as their description, but it's what they don't put down. Because if they're not putting it down, then they haven't considered that as workplace violence, or at least it's not at the top of mind. So I think it's really, really important that we take into consideration where people come from, how they see, and some of that may be generational. And there's still people in our industry that think that there's an expectation that you should expect to be hit by a cane or pushed or someone to be crabby with you. And there's others that are there that are not looking at that as being acceptable behaviors in the workplace going forward. So when we look at this, and this little cartoon I thought is a really cute way of looking at it, they're probably pretty desperate. One was on an island, just wanted someone to come on a boat and rescue them, and the guy on the boat just wants land. And that's a little bit about where we're at. And when we think about, you know, when you're looking at perspective, it's to put something into perspective. It's to look at it in relationship to the surroundings and the other relevant information. So I think this does a really good job of that. If you've been on the island for a long time, you want to get off, the guy in the boat's been in the boat, wants to get on land, and vice versa. So I think we have to be clear on what our perspectives are and what the organization's perspectives are in regards to workplace violence, because we are looking at it through a different lens. And perception, now I'll admit, I looked at this and I could not figure out why the person on the right could come up with a 3. I'm like, I only seen the 4. I never even looked at the other end where it's 3 there, and it's a bit of an optical illusion. But when you look at perception, it's a process in which the sensory information is received and interpreted by the brain. And so we need to see and accept those different perspectives, because that's what makes a stronger program, and that's what makes us better understand workplace violence. So for sort of your commonplace things that happen, that's good examples of this, is people who see the same event see it quite differently. And we see this in the legal system. You know, they say eyewitness accounts aren't very good because people see it through their perspective, right, and their perceptions of what happened. And it's amazing what the mind sees and doesn't see. And simply when we point out that it looks like 4 at one end and 3 on the other, you see it. But until somebody points it out, and before Louise explained it to me, I only saw the 4. So just, you know, a perfect example. When we went around the province, at each of our workshops, we did a little exercise, and we asked everybody to use either one word or 2 words that sort of link together, like verbal abuse or cyberbullying or sexual harassment. But we asked them to put 1 or 2 words together that described what workplace violence meant to them. And it's interesting, so if we look, they're roughly geographically placed as best we could on the chart of Nova Scotia. And really the more prominent the word is in each of the individual pictures is that it came up more often in that grouping than some of the other words. It doesn't mean that any one word is less impactful or significant than the other. It's just what's at top of mind. So we went into this thinking more about the physical implications from a worker to resident type situation. And what we left with this was a bigger picture on the effects of social media bullying, and that's evident in these pictures. So that's interesting, and we are going to be putting these in our newsletter coming out at the end of the month, so you can take a little bit deeper dive and look at those. So when we look at workplace violence, there's 4 different types. And there's, you know, external, which is where there's somebody that has no relationship or connection to the organization, comes in and there's some type of altercation. So that happens rarely, but it can happen, and we need to be prepared for that. Then there's situations where there's violence between the worker and the resident, or family members, visitors, those type of altercations, which do happen, and a lot of that we're trying to reduce through understanding what the needs are, and what the unmet, you know, what the triggers are of the clients that we serve. And then we look at worker to worker, and we know for the most part, and I think, you know, we don't have a lot of physical worker on worker things that happen, but one thing that came out loud and clear in the workshop is when it comes to worker as part of workplace violence, harassment, exclusion, gossiping, and bullying is a real problem within our sector. And I don't know if it's just our sector, but I think in society today, but it is prevalent in our sector. And then we look at workplace violence, where it's somebody's personal relationship with an employee has an effect on the workplace. And we had a lot of discussions within the workplace on 2 factors. One, on the harassment, because it's not a requirement outright in our workplace violence legislation, although I think there is a need for you to address it through the general duty clause and other sectors about taking care of all, you know, addressing all risks. And the same with workplace violence. A lot of people, because it's not in the legislation in Nova Scotia, think that we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to be in people's business. But when we were out around the province, we really got some feedback and validation that they are dealing with issues of harassment from worker to worker, as well as domestic violence. where they have people that are going through domestic disputes, and that sort of comes into the workplace, or there's a fear of that coming into the workplace, and or it could present itself in a worker comes and or somebody comes and slashes a worker's tires. We have another video on workplace harassment that we're going to show you, so if you'll just bear with us for a moment.
There was always so much tension. His yelling and screaming paralyzed me. She quickly made it her job to take me on and make me feel less than.
Oh, you would yell at me. Tell me I wasn't smart.
I didn't want to cry because that's what the bully wanted me to do. How can I face people at work? I need to.
It was a ploy to catch me with my guard down.
I never knew what to expect. He did this on purpose to keep me guessing.
A total place of helplessness.
Okay, so I think that was a very good kind of overview of just sort of bullying in general across many sectors. One of the other things that came up when we were out talking with folks, it was really around social media on Facebook, Twitter, and those types of things. And I think when Facebook and Twitter and all of that social media thing first arrived sort of into the workplace, our biggest concern was how much time people were spending on those sites, not really thinking about how that was going to impact the workforce. And there was a recent incident, I mean, it just sort of all sort of fell into place just recently. It started, it's a story about an organization in Corner Brook. It's a pulp and paper mill, and the worker kind of unleashed some flurry of comments about their manager on Facebook and posted it. And it was very, very, the link is there. If you read the article, it wasn't, there was no sugarcoating. It was very crude, very explicit, and it was very threatening. So the worker was asked to do a duty at work, didn't agree or didn't agree with it, or felt that it was unsafe, or whatever led up to that. went home, put this remark on Facebook, the manager found out about it, felt that it was inappropriate, and suspended the worker for a day as a result of that. When the worker came back to work, it just didn't seem to go away. There was a lot. The worker was very agitated, was very upset about everything that had happened, and there was lots of things, inappropriate behaviors and things that happened as a result of that. So they dismissed the employee, it went through arbitration, and that was upheld. So I think that it just shows that we're going to be dealing with these types of things more and more, and we've heard a little bit of that from the folks as we've gone around the province over the last month, and have been hearing, maybe not to this extent, but hearing the stories. So I guess I just opened the phone lines up to ask people, does anybody currently have any policies addressing social media or the use, or in your harassment policy, is it addressing social media?
We do have a policy on social media at Sunset.
Do you? Yes. And is that just about the use, like whether they can use it at work, or is it about not putting harassing comments on those social media sites?
Yeah, it's about the confidentiality about not to discuss work, you know, on social media.
Good. That's wonderful. When we may be in contact with you when we start to develop some templates for some of your fellow folks to see, because it is, I know it's something new, and sometimes we have to go back. Anybody else?
Here at Rosedale, we have one similar, Heather.
Do you? Good. Good. That's really good. So people are starting, and it's probably a little bit like, are you seeing this happening in your workplace? Is it were you being proactive, or did it come from a necessity that something happened which then facilitated that change in the policy?
Well, in our situation, I think it was just a proactive approach.
Proactive, great. That's good. Because we've had
in our organization, it was both.
It was both, yeah.
But there had been some instance of Facebook postings as well. It's all but we do have a social media policy, which is separate from our cell phone Facebook.
Right. Which is, I mean, it's our new reality. And we've had, when we were out doing the workshops, we had a few discussions. So there are organizations that have had to, you know, go down the disciplinary path. And unfortunately, I don't think it was with the same person, but, you know, it's happened on more than one occasion where they've had to bring people in and go through a disciplinary process based on misuse of those for, you know, that have negatively impacted other workers or clients or the organization itself. So I think it's something that, you know, if you're not there yet, it's okay. In our section on step 3 on policies and procedures, I don't know that we had something in there on a social media type policy that people could use as a resource, and that was because that wasn't at top of mind of us from the working group going in. But boys, when we get out into the field, we sure heard what's really happening out there, and how prevalent it is, and how there is a need to address that. So I think that's very interesting, and now there's getting to be some sort of case law and different things that are starting to maybe help guide people on what the realities are and what's acceptable. And as we know, sometimes common sense doesn't really play a part. So when we talk about workplace violence and where does it happen, we know it happens everywhere. You know, it's in the hallways, it's in the offices, it's in the patient, client, resident rooms, meeting rooms. It can happen outside for your staff that may, if they're taking clients out or residents out, you know, so it can be at conferences, Tim Hortons parking lots, residents' home for our home care workers that are sometimes going into homes where there's violent situations and domestic violence happening, vehicles. And then the one that we've added, because we've heard so much about, is, you know, this virtual workplace. You know, you go home at the end of the day and you're not necessarily getting away from the bullying that's taking place because it's entering your home through social media. So I think that's something that we need to be aware of at all times, that it can happen anywhere, anytime, and is your program, you know, reflective of that. So when we go on to identifying, you know, sort of now what, so what you want to start to think about is starting to identify who in your organization is going to be the person that's going to be responsible for ensuring that this program or your program gets in place or is reviewed, maintained, however you want to do that. So, you know, and there has to be someone that's going to be held accountable for that. And then you want to start looking at how you're going to implement step one. So this is, what's your team going to look like? Are you going to be using existing safety committee members? Does your team need to be different than that? Does there need to be some safety committee members and some other folks? So you need to consider that and start to think about what that's going to look like. And then you need to consider your communication plan. So for each of the 3 steps, we do have a communication memo there that you can use, that you can cut, paste, slash. That's for anything we've produced. We know that most organizations have something. Some have it all. Some are looking for those continuous improvement pieces, and they can select. Some have smaller programs that they're trying to make bolster them up a bit. So you can use any part of anything we have, and that goes for the communication. So what's your communication plan? What are you going to tell employees? What are you going to tell, whether you're going further up the chain to a board of directors or other ownership organizations that are part of the organization? So you need to do that, and then you need to think about what's the timeline, what's the expectations. Now, we all know what timelines are like. Louise and I started this. We were going to be done by now. We're just going to write the program, send it off to you folks, and we were all done. And then you start to realize it's bigger than that. And yes, we could have done that and checked a box and said we were done, but that really wasn't going to help you guys. So we've taken on this approach of doing the workshops and the webinars and doing more to be more supportive of you. And then start to review what you need to gather and what you need to collect. So really start to get your head around what do you need to do to be able to do steps 1, 2, and 3. And at any time, if you're kind of struggling with that, or you're trying to figure out in more detail what that looks like, you can contact either Louise and we can work with you individually to help you make that happen. So just to give you a little bit of sort of what's next, what's coming up. So this was webinar 1. And we're recording it, and it'll be available in the next week. So if there were staff that couldn't make it, or you want to use this when you have your first group to get together to review this, you'll be able to have that recording there and use that. The second webinar, which is November 5th, just around the corner, and that's where during the workshop we didn't have a lot of opportunity to go through in detail the program review. So for those that wanted to have more time and ask questions about that, we're going to dedicate that hour to really going through the program review. We will touch a little bit on the perception survey, but it's mainly going to be the program review. And then for the webinar 3, we're going to do the risk assessment, and probably at the tail end of that, we had originally thought when we booked the webinar we would talk about the policies and procedures today, but rather than, we just thought we better best keep it in order. And we're going to go through the risk assessment piece, because when we did the workshop as well, depending on how things went that day, you might have gotten 10 minutes or 20 minutes to do that. And for those that are quite comfortable with that, that was plenty of time. It was a little refresher. But for those that weren't so comfortable with that, we want to spend more time on that. So we're going to spend some significant time going through a scenario or two to go through the risk assessment process to get you comfortable with that tool. And then at that time, we'll probably just show you again where you can find everything for step 3, and maybe at that point we might have any added, we know we have to add something on cyberbullying and social media, and we hope as you start to do your review and you look at what we have, if there's anything that you've identified that we're missing, or if you have something that we don't, that you can say, hey, you know, you should have a policy around this. We have it and we found it useful. So that's kind of like the support for what we've already rolled out. In November, we will have step 4, which is about reporting, documenting, and investigating, and we've got quite a few tools with this. And this is really, you know, what do we need to do? What do we need to keep in mind when we're doing the investigation when we're talking about incidents of violence? Step 5 is on information, education, and training, which will be out in February of next year. And that's not to recreate all the great training programs that are out there, but one of the things that we're going to try to do is that general information, a little bit around the legislation, a little bit around our stats, and really about making the connection for people between the training they're currently getting and that it is workplace violence prevention training. Some of our groups, when they've done the rollout, all the stuff was piloted before we unleashed it on the province. And some of the feedback on the perception survey, when we asked, have you had workplace violence prevention training, they didn't see the pieces and the you first as workplace violence prevention training. So we're going to try to find a way to make those links and connections. And then step 6, as we go through this process, we have come across so many great things in regards to personal protective equipment, harassment, domestic violence, cyberbullying, and who knows what else we'll find as we go through steps, finish step 4 and 5. And so we're developing really a big toolkit on leading practices and policies and things that you guys will have access to. Then in the spring of next year, we'll be back on the road again and really rolling out steps 4, 5, and 6, and they'll have subsequent webinars as well. And anybody who had registered through our workshop, we have a regular communication that will be sent out to people saying, you know, this is kind of what you need to do next. For anybody who's registered for the webinar but hasn't participated in our workshop, we'll add you to that email list so that you will get those communications as well. So you'll know about upcoming webinars that we might have, or communications or suggestions that you can make, or updates that we do to the program.
I get it coming through the telephone.
Pardon? Oh, that's someone else. Anyways, I wanted to thank you for taking the time. And as always, we always have a few technical glitches, but I think we got everybody on. But I wanted to give this an opportunity. If anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask, while Louise and I are here, we would do our best to answer those. Anybody have any questions?
Heather, somebody may have asked before, but I'm just wondering about the actual toolkit itself that you had referenced in the first slide.
Right. So they're available online.
Okay.
So if you go to the Awareness website, thank you, Arlene, that's good. For those that weren't at the workshops, and I know you weren't able to attend, if you go to the Awareness website, and you go to initiatives.
Okay.
So there's 3 little tabs. There's Learn, Initiatives, and News. If you go to Initiatives, when you click on that, you'll see workplace violence. And when you click on that, we don't have you clicking too much, it opens up and it gives all of the tools. So for example, let me see if I could maybe bring this up quickly. Oh, of course, you know, this is when you get all of the, I can just kind of walk you through it a bit, because I think this is, we debated on whether doing this or, as well. So when you click on initiatives, and then you see workplace violence, and you click there, when you stroll down, there's everything you need for steps 1, 2, and 3. So this is the communication memo, which just, all the communication memos are one-pagers that really just talked a lot about, you know, what our issues are, what we're facing, so you can take those. And then the other tool, this is really good. This is the program audit. So you can, and this is interactive, so you can type into the section and put your responses in there. And this is divided out. So the first section is on workplace culture, and then it's the compliance piece, so what the legislation's saying you need to do. And then there's the best practices on domestic violence and harassment.
Okay, great, thank you.
The other, pardon me?
Thank you.
Okay, and then there's the introduction piece and the perception survey that we recommend that you be brave and give this to your staff, and because I think so often what we think we told our staff and what they've heard are two different things. So this perception survey gives you some insight to that. Okay, that's wonderful. Any other questions? No? That's great. I want to thank you all for coming today, and we'll be chatting soon, and feel free to contact us if you need anything. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.